We recently visited Occupy Dartmouth's campus encampment, and although the student here said that she didn't really understand foreign policy, she doubtlessly would have condemned globalization if it was brought up as third world oppression. Ironically, this would likely represent the ideas of the Occupy movement as a whole, whose members call for democracy and equality, which, as we'll see, globalization helps accomplish in the third world without bombs and guns, and actually makes the first world wealthier.
Now, you can argue for hours about if globalization helps the third world, and if we accept the premise that it does, which is what I believe, then this voluntary wealth shifting in exchange for goods and services from the first world to the third world has another very important purpose to serve. It'll help liberate the third world from the crushing oppression of socialism and statism. Let's start with the example of a very small African country named, though most famous for its hyperinflation, not far behind its fame for its oppressiveness, both economically and politically. In fact, it's so oppressive that people flee from it left and right, coming to the free, capitalistic first world. In my own town, we have a famous soccer player who got out of Zimbabwe because of persecution. One of my favorite economists, Wealthier Williams, writes brilliantly about this in his piece, Foreign Aid to Africa. Zimbabwe provides an excellent example of why foreign aid as a way out of poverty is a fool's errand. Not that long ago, Zimbabwe was one of the more prosperous African countries. Salem University, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Professor Craig Richardson writes, quote, "Few countries have failed as spectacularly or as tragically as Zimbabwe has over the past half-decade. Zimbabwe has transformed from one of Africa's rare success stories into one of its worst economic and humanitarian disasters," unquote. It has the world's highest rate of inflation, currently over 1,000%. President Robert Mugabe blames domestic and foreign enemies, particularly England and the United States, for trying to bring about his downfall. Of course, according to Mugabe and some of the world's academic elite, there's that old standby excuse, the legacy of colonialism, and multinational firms exploiting the third world. The drought is used to explain the precipitous drop in agricultural output. Then there's AIDS. But then, Walter Williams goes on and talks about Botswana, Zimbabwe's neighbor, which has the second highest rate of AIDS in the world and shares the Kalahari Desert with Zimbabwe. So if there's a drought in Zimbabwe, there's probably going to be a drought in Botswana. Also, it used to be an English colony, just like Zimbabwe. However, listen to this, Botswana has one of the world's highest per capita GDP growth rates. Moody's and Standard & Poor's gives Botswana an A credit rating, the best credit risk on the continent, a risk competitive with countries in Central Europe and East Asia. Botswana, compared to our other African neighbors, prospers not because of foreign aid. There's rule of law, sanctity of contracts, and in 2004, Transparency International ranked Botswana as Africa's least corrupt country. There's lots of other evidence supporting this position that not foreign aid or help or wealth transfers from richer countries to poorer countries is what's going to help them, but private property rights and rule of law and capitalism is what will help them. So if we accept the premise that the solution for the problems of the third world is capitalism, how do we bring a third world to capitalism? We know that oftentimes the third world is ruled over by brutal dictators, who of course won't want to let go of their power. So how can we in the first world who enjoy the infrastructure of capitalism give those in the third world the same tools we had to rise out of poverty? Well, one approach which has been used by our government over the last 10 years is good old-fashioned warfare. And even though the original intent of the Iraq War was to find the weapons of mass destruction, by the time it became apparent that there were no weapons of mass destruction, the line had changed to, well, we went in to depose Saddam Hussein, a brutal dictator. Of course, no one was unhappy to see Saddam deposed, but is it the best way? Another main way the United States has gotten its interests met overseas by overthrowing governments is through subversives, counter-revolutionaries like the Contras in Nicaragua. Recently in the Republican debate, Newt Gingrich said we should support the counter-revolutionaries to overthrow Ahmadinejad in Iran. And at least when we're funding counter-revolutionaries, we're not sending our own men to fight, but we're still spending money extracted from the private economy on bombs and guns which destroy property and are very expendable. Is there a way that we can bring liberty to the masses of the world while also growing our own wealth? Yes, it's called globalization. Now the antidote here I'm going to give for third world oppression is going to make a lot of pharmacists angry. People like Mark Levin. If we took this policy approach, then a lot of defense spending would become unnecessary and it would only be natural to cut it to help reduce the deficit. And that would make people like Mark Levin angry because he says we can't cut any defense spending. It'll also make people on the left kind of angry, like Naomi Klein, who's an anti-globalist. But I'm going to say it anyway. And we've got a nice Swedish gentleman on our side, Johan Norberg, who I'm going to cite in a minute. But let's look at some things quickly. The communist government there keeps order through both controlling media, but also by keeping their people in a state of perpetual starvation. And the flip side of this would be Saudi Arabia, which is largely hated by its inhabitants because, with the help of the West, the Saudi tribe was put in control of the others. Richard Maybury aptly explains that this would be like a family called Smith taking over Canada, and then the world starts recognizing it as Smith Canada. We'll recognize the Saudi regime's rule over Arabia as Saudi Arabia. But they made payments recently to their people to try to quell their revolutionary uprisings. They control so much of the oil money, and there's such income inequality, statism in that country, that they try to make a payout to the people to kind of satisfy them, making them dependent on the government and kind of calming their revolutionary feelings. That kind of dependence on the government matched with this perpetual poverty can create a dependence on a statist government, even if it would be better to overthrow it and institute capitalism. Now, when the United States was just starting and when it was just the 13 colonies, we were dependent on England, and we didn't want to break away from England back when we were just starting. But as we became richer and more affluent and we could afford to worry about things like taxes on tea, that's when the revolutionary fervor kicked in. And it may be kind of a fallacy to compare the US to these countries because the US was pretty free as far as the standards went when we broke away from England. But if people are in poverty, if they're reliant on the government, and if they're weak and they need protection, then they're going to rely on the government no matter how bad it is. So the question is, how can we raise these people out of poverty without using guns and money to allow them to gain that revolutionary fervor to overthrow their governments? How can we bring them a bit of the prosperity that has allowed us to thrive in the capitalist world? The answer is globalization. The Swedish gent Johan Norberg shows why globalization works so well in the example of a small, now less communist country called Vietnam. Now, one of the main complaints of people who are against globalization is that multinationals exploit third world workers. It's a basic economic fact that worker productivity is directly tied with wages, even in highly industrialized and wealthy countries like the United States. But this doesn't tell the whole story either, because in fact, Vietnamese exploitation seems more like improvement, as Johan Norberg explains in his piece, The Noble Feat of Nike. He writes, Nike, it means victory. It also means a type of expensive gym shoe. In the minds of the anti-globalization movement, it means both at once. Nike stands for the victory of a Western footwear company over the poor and dispossessed. But, as he goes on, a little bit more depth of thought will prove that actually Nike, through the profit motive, is benefiting the workers of Vietnam. So I was interested to hear someone not only praising Nike sweatshops, but also claiming that Nike is an example of a good and responsible business. That someone was the Communist Party of Vietnam. He goes on to talk about work inside a sweatshop he visited. He says, the work does look tough and the conditions grim if we compare Vietnamese factories with what we have back home. But that's not the comparison these workers make. They compare the work at Nike with the way they lived before, or the way their parents and neighbors still work. And the facts are revealing. The average pay at a Nike factory close to Ho Chi Minh is $54 a month, almost 3 times the minimum wage for a state-owned enterprise. And then he talks to a woman who works in the sweatshop, and she makes 5 times more than her husband. But she says she used to work in a rice paddy, so Norberg is astonished. He's like, wouldn't you rather be working in the rice paddy under the blue sky and the green fields than in this closed-up factory? But then he says, you know, I'm a Swede, and I only have 3 months of summer, and it's a temperate summer. But for her, working in the fields means 10 to 14 hours a day in the burning sun or the intensive rain, in the rice fields with water up to your ankles and insects in your face. Even a Swede would prefer working 9 to 5 in a clean, air-conditioned factory. Furthermore, a night job comes with a regular wage, free or subsidized meals, free medical services, and training and education. The most persistent demand Nike hears from the workers is for an expansion of the factories so that their relatives can be offered a job as well. He goes on then and points out, this isn't altruism, it's capitalism, the profit motive. Bring new machinery, better technology, new management and production ideas, a larger market, and the education of their workers. That is exactly what raises productivity. And if you increase productivity, the amount a worker can produce, you also increase his wage. So actually, this greedy multinational corporation coming in and supposedly exploiting Vietnam is improving and laying the infrastructure, more importantly, for even greater improvements. This is through the ruthless force of competition and profit and loss. Now some people might say, oh, you know, Nike's a fluke in Vietnam. It's just a strange coincidence. All the rest of the multinationals are exploiting. But Johan Norberg goes on and says, Nike isn't the accidental good guy. On average, multinationals in the least developed countries pay twice as much as domestic companies in the same line of work. If you get to work for an American multinational in a low-income country, you get 8 times the average income. If this is exploitation, then the problem in our world is that the poor countries aren't sufficiently exploited. But finally, and while all of this is good, and of course greater wealth leads to more security, and that security will lead to revolutionary tendencies, as we've seen many times, something more important is that sometimes multinationals will just come in and completely liberalize the economy. The freedoms will still be missing, the personal freedoms, but actually they've accomplished half of what needs to be done without even having the people rise up. For example, Norberg writes, with growing productivity, it will also be possible to invest in education and healthcare in Vietnam. Since 1990, when the Vietnamese communists began to liberalize their economy, exports of coffee, rice, clothes, and footwear have surged. The economy has doubled, and poverty has been halved. Nike and Coca-Cola triumphed where American bombs failed. They have made Vietnam capitalist. This is exactly the reason why we can't practice protectionism in the United States. We want to protect our manufacturing jobs, and jobs we don't like outsourcing. Outsourcing has a bad name. But in a different article, Johan Norberg points out that external barriers such as rich country protectionism in goods of particular importance to the third world, textiles and agriculture, that, according to UNCTAD, deprives developing countries of nearly $700 billion in export income a year, almost 14 times more than they receive in foreign aid. So while a lot of westernized advanced countries want to send more foreign aid to backwards countries, that won't solve the problem. Meanwhile, we rob these countries of the productive infrastructure that would help raise their standard of living and eventually inspire revolutionary tendencies. It's always seductive to believe that the government can come in and solve all the problems of poverty, but we've seen that it's capitalism, the ability to own property, that can lay the productive infrastructure for countries like this. And at first, wages may be low, conditions may be bad, but as competition and productivity goes up, it will naturally evolve to have better standard of living, consequently better working conditions and better wages. It's an evolutionary process, and we may want governments to step in right away and try to fix all the problems, but until the wealth has been generated that can make life better in these countries, which can be brought about by greedy, selfish corporations, globalization, looking for profits, bringing machinery into these countries, we can't do a thing. That's why we've got to rely on the market. The market knows how to maximize value for all parties involved. The free market makes everyone better off, and that's why I believe that globalization is the solution to the problems of the third world. It may just skip the extra step. It may just liberalize their economy, and then the people can save their energy for fighting for their political freedoms, like freedom of speech and the right to vote. Anyway, that's my video, and I hope you liked it. If you want more information on how globalization is good, read columns by Walter Williams. He's brilliant on this issue. You can also read stuff by Johan Norberg. He's almost exclusively dedicated to this issue. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching, anyone who did. And I hope you like this. Free market rocks, government intervention knocks, enterprise system barriers, making the situation hairier. Globalization is good, and whether you loved it or hated it, please leave a comment below. Alright, thank you. Yep. Good, I just finished my vid.